Hello and welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be taking a first look at an upcoming tier 10 Czechoslovakian heavy tank, the VZ60S. This is another new heavy tank at tier 10 that is coming to the Supertest. We've got quite a few at the minute. We've got the Griffon, we've got the MBT-B, we've got the Shirtval, and then we've got this, the VZ60S. So we're forming quite a nice collection of tier 10 heavy tanks on the Supertest. But this tank straight away might look familiar if any of you play the Leicester, so the Russian now alternative game to World of Tanks, where this tank is already in their game, but as a tier 8 premium tank called the TST. This thing, however, on EU is coming to the Supertest as a tier 10 heavy without, obviously, premium status, so get into its statistics. So, as a Czechoslovakian heavy tank, it's going to bring 450 alpha. 450 alpha is a brand new alpha damage at tier 10. We have not currently got anything that packs 450 alpha. It's quite a nice amount of alpha, I must say. You really want higher than 440, kind of at the minimum now, for heavy tanks, especially at tier 10. Just because of the alpha damage creep, and alpha currently in the meta is king. 440, 450, which the VZ has, is actually okay and will work. In terms of penetration, 258 standard AP, that's quite okay. 315 gold APCR, that's completely fine. It's going to be towards the lower end, don't get me wrong, especially when you have tanks like the E5, which packs 340. But 315 APCR, and that is the important bit, it's APCR, is really quite nice. Especially when its APCR has 1280 meters a second shell velocity, this thing will be able to snipe. But will it? Let's look at its gun handling. In terms of its gun handling, 2 seconds aim time is mwah, that is beautiful. For a heavy tank to have 2 seconds aim time, this thing will feel snappy, especially when you can combine it with its 0.33 base dispersion. Yeah, this thing has really quite nice gun handling. When you combine that with a decent DPM, because it's got an 11.5 second reload for 450 alpha, yeah, this thing actually has a decent DPM, decent armor penetration values, and decent gun handling. So this is looking quite exciting. It has 8 degrees of gun depression, which works really nicely with that firepower. Does its mobility stack up? Well, yeah, it does. 40 for a heavy tank is completely fine. Put a turbo on it, you're pulling this closer towards 45, 46. However, it is let down slightly by its power to weight ratio. It isn't the highest, so it will feel a little bit sluggish, maybe over softer terrains and when going up hills. But on flat ground, 40, perfectly fine. You will get into positions really quite quickly. In terms of survivability, let's see. 2100 HP is a little bit on the lower end. However, completely fine. Runner hardening, it's 2300, which is completely workable. And as you can probably see, I've made a couple of changes to this original graphic because they've already updated some of the armor model and some of the armor statistics. It has got 100 millimeters on the hull. Ignore that, I've slightly got that the wrong way around. So 100 millimeters on the hull, which is okay. It has got some kind of funky heat shielding, which I imagine will work very similar to the STRV-103B's kind of heat shield on the front. So you fire heat into that, it will get absorbed. However, fire AP, APCR, yeah, different story. You should be completely okay with that. But its upper hull does look pretty well angled. It's pretty flat, but it's pretty extremely angled. So maybe it's weak to heat, especially if it's shooting at it on flat ground. However, APCR, I imagine, unless it's super high penetration, will be an auto ricochet. So this thing looks like it's got quite nice hull armor, despite it being 100 millimeters on paper. 330 turret, that's lovely. This thing has got shielding, very, very similar to the Super Conqueror. So it's got a heat shield which runs all the way around the turret, making this thing probably pretty impervious to heat ammunition. If, you've ever fought the Super Conqueror, for example, you will know you can only really pan around this gun. And it looks like it's going to be a very similar scenario here. Probably underneath the gun will be a weakness, same as a Super Conqueror, and probably its gun mantlet left, right, and on the top would also be a bit of a weakness. It does look like it's got a slightly angled down roof towards the gun, maybe making this thing vulnerable to AP overmatches on the roof. However, in general, 330 turret, mwah, that's lovely. This thing looks pretty fearsome so far. Let's compare it now to two other tanks that we already have in the game that I feel are pretty similar. So we've got the M5Y, the 120mm gun, so the 440 Alpha gun, and the Object 260, which is obviously attainable for everyone, but it is a pretty close comparison actually to the VZ60S. So, in terms of DPM, the VZ60S has 2,348 base. That is completely fine. It's less than the M5Y and slightly less than the Object 260. However, 2,300 is completely okay, especially when you run things like a gun rammer. You're pulling that up towards 3,000. Alpha damage, as I said, of 450 is a new one. We don't actually have anything with 450 alpha currently, so it's basically probably going to be the new 440, but 450 for the VZ is better than the M5Y and the 260's 440. Reload time, slightly longer for the VZ60S, but it has got higher alpha, so we can expect that. 11.5 compared to 10.6 for the M5Y and 11 seconds for the 260. Dispersion and aim time is where this tank excels, and we really see how this tank is going to stand out from the other two tanks in this comparison. 0.33 dispersion is beautiful. It is significantly better than the M5Y's 0.37, which is very traditional for especially a tier 10 heavy, and it is better than what is considered to be quite good gun handling, which is the Object 260 at 0.35. Aim time, 2 seconds. Once again, pretty abnormal for a heavy tank. Normally, we expect medium tanks to have 2 seconds, but it's 2 seconds compared to 2.3 for the M5Y and 2.2 for the Object 260. So as I said, this thing's gun is going to be pretty snappy, and it is going to stack up well to its opponents. In terms of mobility, so identical mobility to the M5Y, which is a pretty nippy tier 10 heavy tank, but it does not compare to the Soviet Object 260, which bombs around the battlefield at 60. Different kind of comparison there. However, 40 is not that slow, not that slouchy, and you will still be able to get around pretty quickly. In terms of gun depression, it is a nice middle ground between these other two tanks. 8 degrees is perfect. It is better than the 6 degrees that the Object 260 gets. It will open up a lot of different positions. However, it just does not even compare to the 12 degrees of gun depression that the M5Y got when it was buffed in January. HP pool, identical to the Object 260 with 2,100 apiece, and slightly less than the M5Y's 2,200, which did get increased in the January update. So in general, pretty competitive with gun depression and HP. View range, pretty irrelevant. It's got slightly less than the M5Y and the 260, but 390 is completely fine for a heavy tank. Armor, as we said, I think it's actually going to be better than it probably is on paper, especially the hull armor. 100mm for the hull is going to, I feel, be better than that because of its, we look back again, it's got its heat shield, and it looks to be pretty well angled. However, heat ammunition might be this thing's nemesis, in the hull especially. But its turret armor looks completely fine to me. It probably will work pretty similar to the Super Conquerors, that's what I feel. So it stacks up pretty well to its opponents here, the M5Y and the Object 260. Penetration values. The VZ60S is basically identical to the M5Y and the 260. 258 compared to 260 and 260 for the M5Y and the Object 260. However, it is AP, which is not as good as the Object 260's APCR. APCR as a standard is just a much nicer round, especially when you're sniping, which this thing looks like it's going to be able to do, especially with its good gun handling. However, it does get APCR as gold, which is really nice. 315 gold APCR is better than the M5Y's 310mm heat, which is strange. APCR having better penetration than heat. However, it doesn't stack up to the lovely heat penetration that the Object 260 gets of 340. So there you go. That is the VZ60S, a upcoming tier 10 Czechoslovakian heavy tank. It looks competitive. It looks rather competitive, I must say. I think this tank is going to be very strong when it comes into the meta, probably resembling a nice comparison between the current Super Conqueror and the Object 260. It's going to kind of fall into that nice middle ground of having alpha damage whilst having decent DPM, good gun handling, and mobility, with maybe questionable armor, especially versus heat ammunition. This thing I feel will be pretty competitive. As to when we see it, I think this tank has all of the hallmarks of an assembly shop tank. As to when, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Potentially, this could be an assembly shop tank into 2026. This has only just come to the super test in April. So I don't think we're going to see this tank for quite a while, because there are other heavy tanks that are being more actively tested, I feel like we're going to see first. However, as a heavy tank, this thing is going to be competitive. It looks very strong, and I'm quite excited to see what they do with it. But do let me know down in the comments, do you agree, do you disagree with me? And yeah, if you did like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all again very soon.